In 1964, during an emergency excavation along the Nile River, now at the border between Sudan and Egypt, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected. A mass grave over 13,000 years old, where 64 individuals had been brutally killed, their bones still pierced with arrowheads, sharp stone blades, and projectile points. There were no signs of ceremonial burial, no nearby dwellings. Just bodies scattered across the ground, skulls shattered, spines crushed, pelvises punctured, clear evidence of a massacre. This place is called Jebel Sahaba, and it is considered the earliest known archaeological evidence of warfare between humans. The most terrifying part? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural disaster, and it wasn't the aftermath of some large battle. It was deliberate, organized, repeated, and no one survived. We are looking at a crime that took place when humans had no writing, no agriculture, no cities, just stone tools and instinct. A systematic purge between hunter-gatherer groups, not over political borders or religion, but over something far older: survival. And from within that dry soil, a disturbing question emerges. Were humans capable of hatred, ambush, and killing long before they ever learned to build houses, plant crops, or write? Could it be that war isn't a product of civilization, but a part of evolution itself? Jebel Sahaba forces us to confront that possibility, because what lies beneath the sands of ancient Sudan may not just be history's first battlefield. It may be proof that from the very beginning, humans were already fighting humans. Part 2. In the heart of a drying world. Around 13,000 years ago, the Nile Valley wasn't what it is today. Not just scorched desert, thin ribbon river water. It was a world in transition, a land shifting from wet to dry, from stability to chaos. As the last ice age receded, global climate patterns began to fluctuate. The great rains stopped. Wetlands, swamps, and grasslands, the very lifeblood of hunter-gatherers, began to vanish. Trees no longer grew. Wild game thinned out. Water became precious. And at the center of that environmental upheaval stood the Kadan culture. They weren't farmers, not officially, not yet, but they had learned to harvest wild grasses using tools to cut, grind, and store seeds. They were among the first humans to settle near specific lands, where there was grass, water, and food. They stopped wandering. They built shelters. They lit hearths. They began to build a life, and from that, territory was born. At first, perhaps they shared, but as fertile land grew scarcer, as wild crops became unreliable, as neighboring groups crossed the river and began gathering from their land, sharing turned into conflict, and conflict escalated into violence. No guns were needed, no borders drawn in ink, just one prolonged dry season, one herd of antelope that didn't return, one patch of reeds taken. That was enough to turn former neighbors into enemies. The world dried up, but the thirst wasn't just for water. It was a thirst for survival, and someone had to pay the price. So what drove those first people, who had just learned to care for wild plants, to turn around and shoot arrows at one another? We'll soon see. The answer lies inside their bones. Part 3. Wounds that never healed. There are no written records, no stone tablets, no ancient texts. The history of Jebel Sahaba is written in human flesh, in fractured bones, in blade marks, in sharp stone fragments still lodged in what once was decaying muscle. Of the 64 skeletons excavated from this ancient cemetery, scientists found that at least 41, about 67%, showed signs of violent trauma. But it's not just the number that stands out. It's the nature of the injuries. Some bore unhealed wounds, arrowheads still embedded deep in pelvic bones, skulls punctured by high-impact blows, vertebrae shattered by crushing force. They died in the middle of violence, struck down during the assault. Others, however, bore healed wounds, a forearm that had been broken and fused crookedly, a rib that had cracked and then mended itself over time. This means they had survived earlier attacks, only to be attacked again. This wasn't a single battle. It wasn't a one-time ambush. It was a pattern, a prolonged campaign of sporadic, brutal raids, repeated over time. Like guerrilla warfare, sudden strikes, retreats, returns, and no real end. Some cuts came from behind. Arrows pierced spines as people fled. Fractures appeared on hands and forearms, likely from trying to shield themselves. Every detail points to the same truth. They were not prepared. They were not warriors. They were victims, caught in a world where death could come at any moment. From behind, while sleeping, while gathering seeds by the riverbank. From their deaths, we read a story no one ever told, and in their unhealed wounds, we glimpse a fear that had already taken root, a silent fear that still echoes to this day. Part 4. Climate Wars. If there's one deep-rooted cause behind every prehistoric war, it wasn't religion, it wasn't honor, and it certainly wasn't tyrants. It was climate. According to archaeologist Hoffman, 1993, the conflict at Jebel Sahaba wasn't an isolated event, but an inevitable consequence of climate change. And decades later, studies from 2021 confirmed the same thing. Drastic environmental shifts were the true spark behind the violence. Because when the grass stopped growing, when wild crops vanished, when the game animals disappeared and hunting traps came up empty, when the river shrank into dry mud and dead fish, there was no more room for mercy. The Cadden culture, once spread across fertile valleys, was now forced to crowd along the banks of the Nile, the last place with water and green. And when dozens of groups crammed into a region that could only support a few, war became inevitable. There was no need for invaders, no ancient grudges required, just a few cases of stolen harvest, a gazelle hunted across a territorial line, or a well claimed by someone else. That was all it took to ignite the cycle of blood. Ambush became a strategy. Night raids became the rule. No one was safe. Not women, not elders, not children. Part 5. Arrows, spears, and the silence of the slain. The dead of Jebel Sahaba wore no shields, no armor. There's no sign that they were warriors, and yet they died by weapons. Weapons that were designed not to kill swiftly, but to inflict pain. Across dozens of skeletons, archaeologists found hundreds of sharp stone fragments, many still embedded deep in bone, in pelvises, shoulder blades, even skulls. These weren't random stones. They had been shaped into deadly points, some with angled or serrated edges, crafted into arrowheads and spear tips. The terrifying part is this. Many of those arrowheads had diagonal or cross-cutting blades, meaning they didn't just pierce flesh, they tore it open wider with every movement the victim made. It wasn't just injury, it was blood loss, agony, and a slow, deliberate death. Some skeletons show cuts from behind, ribs pierced as the victim turned to flee, skulls punctured from above. Others show slashes to the side, where defense is nearly impossible. All of it tells us one thing. The attacks came suddenly, without warning, and without resistance. There was no sign of a face-to-face battle, no clash of equals. Just ambush, just raids, just the slaughter of unarmed people who never saw it coming. Maybe they were asleep, maybe they were picking fruit, maybe they were just taking their child to the river. Then an arrow in the back, a spear from the reeds, and then silence. This was no war between rival armies. It was a massacre, organized, intentional, a slow purge, unannounced, merciless, and thorough. Part 6. No one was spared. In many cultures, women and children are considered off-limits in war, the last to be harmed, protected if not spared. But at Jebel Sahaba, no one was spared. Demographic analysis of the 64 excavated skeletons reveals something chilling. 51% male, 49% female, No gender bias. It wasn't just men who went down in battle. Women were killed too. And it gets worse. Among the skeletons examined in detail were two haunting cases. JS-13 and JS-14, two children, one about 5 years old, the other only 4. JS-14 bore a rectangular puncture wound to the skull, near the eye socket, and a hole at the top of the cranium, both inflicted by a projectile weapon. In other words, a small child was shot in the head. This was no longer a conflict over food. It was extermination. A society had descended to the point of targeting its weakest. Those with no threat, no defense, no understanding. A place where children were shot like warriors, women hunted like men, and the elderly had no refuge. No one was spared. No one was forgiven. There were no longer lines between fighters and civilians. To survive was luck. To die was expected. And we've seen this before. In Rwanda, in Bosnia, under Pol Pot, and in nameless genocides no one talks about. Every time violence crosses the final moral boundary, everyone gets pulled into the abyss. And Jebel Sahaba reminds us we crossed that line long ago, before we had writing, but long after we'd learned how to hate. Part 7. Memories in the Flesh and Bone. Sometimes a single skeleton can tell more than an entire book. Because in every crack, every fracture, every shard of stone still embedded in bone, lies a blood-soaked history of resistance. At Jebel Sahaba, we didn't just find death. We found living memory, carved into the human body. JS-31, a grown man, likely over 30. Inside his body, archaeologists found 17 stone fragments, 2 of them still lodged in bone, one in his cervical spine, another in the pubic bone. He carried many healed injuries, a broken hand, a stab wound to the shoulder, a thigh bone in the process of repairing itself. JS-31 is proof that he survived ambush after ambush, wounded, recovering, and returning to life. But the last time, he didn't get back up. JS-44, a woman also likely over 30. Her arm was broken, with a twist in her forearm suggesting she either tried to block a blow or suffered a violent fall. An arrow had pierced her pelvis from behind, as if she were shot while fleeing. The marks on her bones suggest she didn't die instantly. She was wounded, she fell, and then, we don't know, only that her body was never buried, only abandoned. JS-14, a child. No way to defend, no weapon in hand, no comprehension of what was happening, and yet shot in the head. Each person, a story. Each skeleton, a chapter in the book of prehistoric violence. And from those silent bones, we hear a voice echoing through time. We were killed, but please, do not forget us. Part 8. African, not North African. When people think of the Nile, they often picture Egypt, light-skinned pharaohs, grand stone monuments, and the glittering glory of North African civilization. But Jebel Sahaba reveals a different reality, one far older and far darker in hue. Because when scientists analyzed the morphology, the skull shapes, body proportions, and bone structures of those buried here, they discovered something remarkable. The people of Jebel Sahaba did not resemble ancient North Africans like the Natufians or Ibero-Mauritans. Instead, they closely matched modern sub-Saharan Africans, specifically groups like the San, Pygmies, and populations from Kenya and Uganda. Their skeletons showed clear adaptations to tropical climates, long limbs, lean builds, high surface area to mass ratios for efficient heat dissipation. This tells us that these were people born, raised, and evolved in a harsh environment, not the cold deserts of the north, but the blazing savannas, where water was gold and shade was life. And that means Jebel Sahaba is not just another archaeological site of ancient Egypt, it is a forgotten chapter of Black prehistory, a story left out of the civilization narrative we're taught. Part 9. From Ancient Bones to a Warning for the Future. Jebel Sahaba is more than a cemetery. It is a message buried for 13,000 years and only recently uncovered through shattered bones, flint-tipped arrows, and nameless deaths. It tells us of a society that once thrived, a people who harvested wild plants, who lived in harmony with the natural world, until the climate shifted. The grass stopped growing, the animals never came back, and the rivers shrank, and fear became greater than trust. They weren't killed by invading armies. They didn't fall to foreign conquest. They killed each other, over food, over water, over boundaries that existed only in desperation. And when we look at our world today, something feels very familiar. If you want to understand what our ancestors went through, to better understand where we're headed, subscribe to the channel. We tell the past not to romanticize it, but to warn the future, before you, too, become just another bone in history.